The notification arrived at 6:47 in the morning, while I was still in bed, scrolling through emails with the bleary attention of someone not yet fully awake. A Google alert, the kind I had set up years ago to track mentions of my brand. Usually they led to fashion blogs or boutique websites. This one led to something else entirely. Queen Margrethe III stuns at state dinner in African-inspired jewelry by American designer Vivian Cole. I sat up so fast I knocked my phone off the bed. My hands were shaking as I retrieved it, as I clicked on the link, as I saw the photograph that would change everything. The Queen of Denmark, resplendent in a midnight blue gown, wearing my pieces. The Ancestry Collection, my most personal work. A collar necklace of interlocking gold symbols, matching earrings that cascaded like waterfalls of light, cuffs on both wrists that caught the camera flash and seemed to glow. She stood beside her husband at some official function, surrounded by dignitaries and royalty, and she was wearing jewelry I had made with my own hands. I stared at the image for a long time, tears streaming down my face, memories flooding back to a moment 14 years ago when a man I had loved told me my work was worthless. The collar had taken me 3 weeks to complete. It was my first serious piece, the first time I had attempted something beyond simple earrings and bracelets. I had worked on it every night after Terrence went to sleep, hunched over my makeshift workbench in the corner of the basement, using techniques my grandmother Opal had taught me decades before. The design was inspired by Sankofa, the Adinkra symbol that means, go back and get it, a reminder to learn from the past. I had shaped the gold wire into interlocking birds, their necks curved backward, their beaks touching their tails. Each bird was slightly different, representing generations of women in my family, all connected, all looking back to understand where they came from. I was so proud of that necklace, so certain that Terrence would see its beauty, would understand what I was trying to create, would support my dream of turning my grandmother's teachings into something more than a private hobby. I was wrong. What is this supposed to be? Terrence held the necklace at arm's length, examining it with the expression of someone inspecting a dead insect. It's a Sankofa design. The birds represent... It looks like something from a craft fair. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound that cut through me like a blade. Vivian, come on. You really think someone would pay money for this? I thought maybe I could sell pieces like this. Start a small business. A business? His laughter grew louder, crueler. Selling homemade jewelry? That's not a business, that's a hobby. A waste of time. He dropped the necklace back into the box I had presented it in, as carelessly as if it were trash. Stick to what you're good at. Leave the jewelry to professionals. I stood frozen in our living room, holding the box, feeling something crack inside my chest. Not my heart. I was too angry for heartbreak. Something else. Some illusion I had been maintaining about my husband, about our marriage, about the life I thought we were building together. Terrence walked past me toward the kitchen, already forgetting the conversation, already moving on to whatever mattered more to him than his wife's dreams. I heard him open the refrigerator, heard the crack of a beer can, heard the television click onto some sports program. I looked down at the necklace in the box. The gold still gleamed. The birds still curved backward, still reached for the past, still carried the meaning I had poured into them. Craft fair stuff. That was what he saw. That was all he could see. I closed the box and took it back to the basement. I did not cry. I would not give him the satisfaction, even if he never knew. Instead, I sat at my workbench and looked at the tools my grandmother had given me, the metals I had been learning to shape, the designs I had been dreaming about for years. My grandmother Opal had emigrated from Ghana in 1962, bringing with her the knowledge of generations of metal workers. She had settled in Detroit, married a factory worker, raised a family in a neighborhood that would later be called blighted, but that she always called home. She made jewelry for everyone, wedding sets for brides who couldn't afford store prices, baptism gifts for babies, memorial pieces for families who had lost someone beloved. The gold remembers, she used to say, her weathered hands guiding mine as we worked together. Every piece you make carries memory. Your joy, your pain, your history, it all goes into the metal. That's why our jewelry is different. It's not just decoration, it's story. Grandmother Opal had died when I was 22, 4 years before I met Terrence. Sometimes I wondered what she would have thought of him, whether she would have seen through his charm to the contempt beneath, whether she would have warned me away before I wasted years of my life with a man who could not see my value. I picked up the Sankofa necklace and held it up to the basement light. The birds seemed to glow, seemed to pulse with the life I had breathed into them. I'm going to prove him wrong, Grandma, I whispered to the empty room. I'm going to build something he can't ignore. The next morning, I wore the necklace to church. Not to show Terrence, he never came to church with me anymore, but to show myself that I believed in what I had made. After the service, a woman I barely knew approached me. That necklace is stunning, she said, her eyes fixed on the golden birds. Where did you get it? I made it. You made it? Her eyes widened. Do you sell your work? I would pay good money for something like that. I felt something shift inside me, a door opening that Terrence had tried to keep closed. I'm just starting out, I said. But yes, I sell. She bought a pair of earrings I made for her the following week. $50, my first real sale. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was proof that Terrence was wrong. Someone did want my craft fair stuff, and I was just getting started. The weeks that followed were a study in quiet revolution. On the surface, I continued my role as Terrence's wife, managing the household, attending his work functions, playing the part he expected. But beneath the surface, something was awakening that he could not see. I began documenting my work, photographing each piece I created with care and attention. My phone filled with images of necklaces, bracelets, earrings, cuffs, each one carrying some element of the traditions my grandmother had passed down. I studied other jewelry designers online, learning about pricing, about marketing, about the business side of turning craft into commerce. The woman from church, Denise, became my evangelist. She wore my earrings everywhere, telling anyone who complimented them that her friend Vivian had made them. Within a month, I had a dozen commissions from women in our community who wanted pieces of their own. I worked at night, after Terrence went to bed. The basement became my sanctuary, the one place in our house where I felt completely myself. The smell of metal and flux, the heat of the torch, the delicate work of shaping and soldering. These were my prayers, my meditation, my connection to Opal and all the women who had come before her. Terrence noticed nothing. He was too absorbed in his own world, his job at the bank, his golf games with colleagues, his need to project an image of success that I increasingly found hollow. We had been married for 11 years by then, and I was beginning to understand that the distance between us was not something that could be bridged. We occupied the same house but lived in different universes. My daughter Zara, 15 at the time, was more perceptive. She found me in the basement one night, hunched over a particularly complex piece, and sat down on the old couch I kept in the corner for breaks. "What are you making, Mom?" I showed her the cuff I was working on, a wide band of bronze etched with Dwenemin symbols, ram's horns representing strength and humility. "It's beautiful." She touched the metal gently, tracing the patterns. "Why don't you show Dad?" "Your father doesn't appreciate this kind of work." "Because he's stupid." Zara's bluntness made me laugh despite myself. "Sorry, but it's true. He doesn't understand anything that isn't about money or making himself look good." "Zara, I know. Respect your father." She rolled her eyes. "But Mom, what you're doing here is amazing. These pieces they're like art, like history you can wear." I set down my tools and looked at my daughter, this young woman who saw me more clearly than my husband ever had. "Would you like to learn?" I asked. Her face lit up. "Really? Really? Your great-grandmother taught me. I should teach you." From that night on, Zara joined me in the basement whenever she could. She learned to shape wire, to set stones, to understand the meaning behind the symbols we incorporated into our work. She had natural talent, picking up techniques quickly, bringing her own ideas that pushed my designs in new directions. "You should sell these online," she said one night, holding up a pair of earrings I had just finished. "Set up an Etsy shop or something. You'd make way more money than selling to people from church. Your father would find out." "So? What's he going to do, ground you?" She grinned at her own joke, but there was an edge to it. Even at 15, Zara understood the dynamics of our household better than I wanted to admit. "Mom, you're amazing at this. You shouldn't have to hide it because Dad has issues." She was right, of course, but confronting Terrence about the jewelry business felt like a battle I wasn't ready to fight. The memory of his laughter, of the way he had dropped the Sankofa necklace back in its box, still stung. I wasn't ready to face that dismissal again. "Let me think about it," I said. But I had already decided. Zara's confidence in me, combined with the growing demand from word-of-mouth customers, had made the choice clear. I would build this business one way or another. The only question was whether I would do it openly or in secret. For now, secrecy seemed safer. But I knew it couldn't last forever. The first year of my secret business brought in almost $8,000, more money than I had ever earned on my own. I kept it in a separate account, under my maiden name, building a cushion that felt like freedom, even as I continued living in a marriage that felt increasingly like a cage. I set up the Etsy shop Zara had suggested, using a pseudonym, Opal's Gold, in honor of my grandmother. The orders came slowly at first, then faster as reviews accumulated and algorithms pushed my products to new audiences. I shipped packages from a UPS store across town, keeping the physical evidence of my business away from Terrence's eyes. He noticed nothing. He was too consumed with his own life, his promotions and politics at the bank, his endless need to maintain appearances. Vivian Cole, wife of the successful bank manager, continued to play her role. Opal's Gold, creator of heritage jewelry, lived in a separate world he knew nothing about. But secrets have a way of finding the light, and mine was about to be exposed in a way I never expected. A fashion blogger in Chicago had discovered my Etsy shop and written a small feature about hidden gem jewelry designers. The article was seen by someone who worked at a boutique in Detroit, someone who happened to know Terrence's colleague's wife, someone who mentioned at a party that she had ordered the most beautiful earrings from a designer who lived right here in the city. The chain of coincidence led directly to Terrence, who came home one evening with a printout of the Etsy shop page and an expression of cold fury. "Is this you?" I looked at the printout, at my grandmother's name attached to my jewelry, and knew that the time for secrets was over. "Yes," I said. "It's me." What followed was the worst argument of our marriage, though it would not be the last. Terrence raged about deception, about embarrassment, about what people would think when they learned his wife was peddling trinkets on the internet. I stood my ground, pointing out that his opinion of my work had made secrecy necessary, that his contempt had forced me to build in the shadows. "You made me feel like my art was worthless," I said. "You laughed at me. You called it craft fair stuff. What was I supposed to do? Ask your permission to prove you wrong? I'm your husband. You should have consulted me. About my own talents? About my own dreams?" I shook my head. "This is mine, Terrence. You don't get a vote." The argument ended in stalemate, with Terrence storming off to sleep in the guest room and me returning to my basement workshop. I worked until dawn, channeling my anger and hurt into a pair of chandelier earrings that would later sell for $300. The secret was out. The battle lines were drawn, and I was just getting started. The months following the confrontation were a cold war played out in silence and small cruelties. Terrence did not apologize for his years of dismissal, nor did he acknowledge that my jewelry business had value. Instead, he treated it as an embarrassing secret, something to be tolerated but never discussed. "If you insist on doing this," he said during one of our rare conversations about it, "at least don't use your real name. I don't want my colleagues knowing my wife is selling jewelry on the internet like some kind of merchant." Merchant. He said the word like it was an insult, as if commerce was beneath us, as if the generations of entrepreneurs in my family were somehow shameful. I thought of my grandmother, selling her pieces door to door, building a reputation through quality and integrity. I thought of her mother before her, trading in markets that had existed for centuries. Merchants, all of them. Proud ones. Fine, I said, keeping the peace for reasons I was beginning to question. I'll keep using Opal's gold. The compromise bought me space to operate, though Terrence's disapproval hung over everything like a constant fog. He refused to wear any piece I made, even when I offered him cufflinks designed specifically for him. He changed the subject whenever anyone mentioned my work in his presence. He treated my success as a personal affront, evidence that I was becoming something he could not control. But the business grew despite him. The Etsy shop expanded to include more complex pieces, each one priced according to the time and skill they required. A local boutique in Detroit agreed to carry my work, displaying it in their front window with a sign that read, "Local Artist." Women I had never met began stopping me in grocery stores and restaurants, recognizing me from the small photo on my Etsy profile, telling me how much they loved their Opal's gold pieces. "Your jewelry means something," one woman said, touching the cuff she was wearing, a design featuring the Gai Nyame symbol, the supremacy of God. "Every time I put this on, I feel connected to something bigger than myself." That was what Terrence could never understand. The jewelry wasn't just decoration. It was meaning made tangible, history made wearable, connection across generations and continents. Each piece carried the weight of where we came from and the hope of where we might go. Zara continued to learn alongside me, her skills developing rapidly. At 17, she was creating pieces that matched my own in complexity and beauty. She had inherited my grandmother's hands, it seemed, steady and patient, capable of work that required both strength and delicacy. "I want to do this when I grow up," she said one evening, polishing a ring she had just finished. "I want to work with you." "What about college?" "I'll go to college. Study business, maybe. But this is what I want to do with my life." She held up the ring, examining it in the light. "What we make matters, Mom. Not like what Dad does, sitting in meetings and pushing papers around. This is real. This creates beauty." I hugged her, this daughter who saw my work the way I wished my husband could. "You can do anything you want, baby. And yes, there will always be a place for you here." Terrence overheard this conversation and was not pleased. "You're filling her head with nonsense," he said later, after Zara had gone to bed. "She should be focused on practical careers, medicine, law, something respectable. Jewelry design isn't respectable. It's a hobby, not a career. My hobby made $15,000 last year. How much did your golf game make?" The silence that followed was sharp as a blade. Terrence had no response, so he retreated to his usual tactics. Cold silence, subtle digs, the constant reminder that I was failing to be the wife he had expected. But I was past caring about his expectations. The woman who had hidden in the basement, working in secret, ashamed of her own talents, that woman was disappearing. In her place was someone new, someone who was learning that her husband's approval was not necessary for her success. The turning point came in my 3rd year of operation, when a customer I had never met requested a custom piece for her daughter's wedding. The commission was substantial, $3,000 for a complete bridal set, and required techniques I had never attempted before. I spent 2 months on the project, pushing my skills to their limits, creating something I knew was extraordinary. The wedding was held at a Detroit mansion, a glittering affair attended by the city's black elite. The bride wore my jewelry down the aisle, and photographs of her circulated through the social media feeds of every guest in attendance. One of those guests happened to be a fashion editor at a regional magazine. She contacted me through Etsy, requesting an interview for a feature on Detroit's hidden design scene. I said yes without consulting Terrence. The article appeared 3 months later, accompanied by photographs of my work and a profile that traced my journey from grandmother's teachings to basement workshop to successful online business. The headline read, "The Goldsmith's Granddaughter, How Vivian Cole Preserves African Heritage Through Modern Jewelry." They used my real name. Terrence found out before I could tell him, hearing about the article from a colleague who had seen it in his wife's copy of the magazine. He came home that evening with a fury that exceeded anything I had witnessed before. "You used your real name. After everything I said, you went behind my back and made us the subject of some magazine article." I made myself the subject. It was about my work, not about us. My colleagues are reading about my wife playing jeweler in the basement. How is that not about us? I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar surge of anger that his contempt always provoked. But this time, I did not suppress it. Your colleagues are reading about a successful businesswoman who has built something meaningful. If that embarrasses you, the problem is yours, not mine. The problem is that you refuse to know your place. The words hung in the air between us, more revealing than anything he had said before. My place. He thought I had a place, a role to fill, a box to stay inside. He thought my ambitions were acceptable only as long as they remained invisible, unthreatening to his position as the important one in our marriage. My place, I said slowly, is wherever I choose to put myself. And right now, I choose to be in that magazine, with my real name, building a business that matters. Terrence stared at me as if seeing a stranger. In a way, he was. The woman he had married, the one who had accepted his dismissals and hidden her talents to keep the peace. She no longer existed. I had become someone else, someone stronger, someone who was done apologizing for her own excellence. "This isn't over," he said, and walked out of the room. He was right. It wasn't over. But the ending would not be what he expected. The magazine article brought attention I had never anticipated. Orders flooded in from across the country, overwhelming my capacity to fill them. I had to hire help for the first time. A young woman named Jade who had studied metalworking in college and was thrilled to learn traditional techniques I had inherited from my grandmother. Together, we moved the operation out of my basement and into a small commercial space I rented in a business park. The studio was modest, just 2 workbenches, some equipment, and a small office where I handled orders. But it was mine. A place where Terrence's disapproval could not reach me. He noticed the change, of course. I was spending more time away from home, coming back later, talking about employees and orders and expansion in ways that made it impossible to pretend this was still just a hobby. "You're never here anymore," he accused one evening. "The house is a mess. Dinner is takeout every night. This isn't what I signed up for." "Then unsign," I said, the words coming before I could stop them. "If you're so unhappy with a wife who has her own career, find a wife who doesn't." The suggestion shocked him into silence. We had been together for 15 years by then, and I had never openly threatened the marriage. But the words felt right, felt true, felt like something I should have said years ago. That night, I slept in the guest room for the first time. Not because Terrence exiled me there, but because I chose to. The distance felt like relief. 3 months later, I would discover that Terrence had been having an affair with a loan officer at his bank. By then, it would almost feel like a favor. The discovery of Terrence's affair came through the most cliché of methods. A forgotten receipt in his jacket pocket, left out when he asked me to drop his suits at the dry cleaner. The Grand Hotel, Detroit's most expensive establishment, itemized charges for champagne and room service, dated to a night when Terrence had claimed to be at a conference in Chicago. I stared at the receipt for a long time, feeling surprisingly little. The marriage had been dying for years. This was simply the cause of death, finally revealed. What struck me most was not the betrayal, but the relief. The knowledge that I now had grounds to leave that could not be contested, that could not be minimized, that would stand up in any court. I said nothing to Terrence immediately. Instead, I consulted a lawyer, documented everything I could find, and prepared for the conversation that would end our marriage. When I finally confronted him, his reaction was almost comical in its predictability. Denial first, then blame shifting. "If you had been more attentive, if you hadn't been so focused on your little business, this never would have happened." Then attempts at manipulation disguised as reconciliation. "We can work through this," he said, switching tactics when blame proved ineffective. Counseling, therapy, whatever you need. We've been together 15 years, Vivian. That has to mean something. It meant something when you laughed at my jewelry. It meant something when you called my work embarrassing. It meant something when you demanded I hide my talents to protect your image. I held his gaze steadily. But it stopped meaning enough when you decided to have an affair instead of dealing with your own insecurities. The divorce was finalized within a year. Terrence, true to form, dismissed my business as insignificant during asset negotiations. He took the house, the cars, the investment accounts, all the trappings of the respectable life he valued. I took Opal's gold, now renamed Vivian, in preparation for a new chapter, and every piece of equipment from the studio. His lawyers laughed at the division. Mine smiled knowingly. He has no idea what that business is worth, my attorney said after the papers were signed. Give it 5 years. He'll realize what he gave away. I intended to make it less than 5. The first year after the divorce was both the hardest and the most liberating of my life. I moved into a small apartment near the studio, bringing Zara with me. She had chosen to live primarily with me, visiting her father on weekends with visible reluctance. Marcus, my son, had just left for college and remained diplomatically neutral in the divorce, though his weekly phone calls suggested where his sympathies truly lay. Free from Terrence's constant disapproval, I threw myself into building Vivienne with an intensity I had never permitted myself before. I worked 16-hour days, developing new collections, cultivating relationships with boutiques, learning the intricacies of scaling a creative business. Jade proved to be an invaluable partner, her technical skills complementing my design vision, her enthusiasm matching my own. Within 2 years, Vivian had outgrown the Detroit studio. I made the difficult decision to relocate to New York, where access to the fashion industry, luxury buyers, and international clients would accelerate our growth. Zara, now 20, came with me, enrolling in business courses while continuing to develop her craft. We found a space in the jewelry district, a light-filled studio where we could create, display, and sell all under one roof. The walls displayed the symbols that defined our work: Sankofa birds, Gaianyame curves, Dwenemin horns, the visual language of our heritage, translated into precious metals for a new generation. Grandma Opal would love this, Zara said on our first day in the new space, turning slowly to take it all in. She would, I agreed, and she'd probably tell me the lighting isn't quite right for delicate work. We laughed together, but the mention of my grandmother brought tears to my eyes. Everything I had built, everything I had survived, was in service of the traditions she had passed down. Her hands had guided mine, and now mine guided Zara's, and someday Zara's would guide others. The gold remembered, just as she had promised. I looked around the studio, at the workbenches and display cases and the pieces waiting to find their owners, and I felt something I had not experienced in years of marriage to Terrence. I felt home. The celebrity moment came without warning, as these things often do. An actress I had never met purchased a cuff from our website, nothing unusual. We had many famous clients who ordered online, and wore it to an awards ceremony that happened to be covered by every fashion outlet in the world. Destiny Morgan, 3-time Emmy winner and current star of the most-watched drama on television, walked the red carpet in a gown of midnight silk, her wrist adorned with my wisdom cuff, a band of hammered gold etched with Adinkra symbols representing knowledge and understanding. The cameras caught it from every angle. The fashion commentators noticed immediately. That cuff is absolutely stunning. Who made it? I'm not sure, but look at the detail. Those are African symbols, aren't they? Let's find out who this designer is. By morning, Vivian was trending on social media. Our website crashed from the traffic. My phone exploded with messages from journalists, buyers, and clients I had never heard of. In the space of a single red carpet walk, we had gone from respected niche brand to international phenomenon. Destiny Morgan herself posted about the cuff on her social media, sharing its symbolism and our brand story with her 30 million followers. This incredible piece was made by Vivienne Cole at Vivienne, she wrote. Her grandmother taught her to work with gold using techniques passed down for generations. Every piece carries meaning, history, soul. I'm honored to wear her art. The orders that followed were beyond anything I had imagined. Not just from individuals, but from boutiques and department stores, from stylists requesting pieces for other celebrities, from collectors who saw my work as both fashion and investment. Within weeks, I had to hire 5 additional craftspeople just to keep up with demand. Zara handled much of the business side while I focused on design and production. She had become indispensable, her business courses paying off as she navigated contracts, negotiations, and logistics that would have overwhelmed me on my own. "We need to raise prices," she said during one of our strategy sessions. "Demand is exceeding supply. If we don't, we'll burn out trying to fill orders we're undercharging for. But I want our pieces to be accessible. Not everyone can afford luxury prices." Then we create multiple lines, a prestige collection at true luxury prices, and a more accessible line that still carries our values but uses less expensive materials. She showed me her projections. "This is sustainable. What we're doing now isn't." I looked at my daughter, this young businesswoman who had once sat beside me in a basement, learning to shape wire into beauty. She had grown into someone remarkable, someone who could see possibilities I missed. "When did you get so smart?" "I learned from watching you build something out of nothing," she grinned. "Well, that and the business classes. The expansion brought new challenges and new opportunities. I traveled to Ghana for the first time since childhood, seeking to reconnect with the traditions that had given my work its soul. I found artisans in Accra and Kumasi who worked in gold as their ancestors had for centuries, and I established partnerships that would ensure our materials came from sources we could be proud of. I also started a training program for young Ghanaian metalworkers, bringing them to New York for intensive courses in contemporary jewelry design, while they taught us techniques that had survived colonization and globalization. The exchange was transformative for everyone involved, connecting our brand to its roots in ways that resonated deeply with customers who craved authenticity. Vivienne was featured in Vogue, then Harper's Bazaar, then Elle. My pieces appeared in museum exhibitions about African art in the diaspora. Collectors began treating my work as investment-grade art, willing to pay premium prices for one-of-a-kind pieces that would only appreciate over time. And through it all, Terrence watched from the sidelines. He called occasionally, conversations that began with questions about the children and inevitably turned to comments about my success. He had remarried, to the loan officer, ironically, and was by all accounts living the respectable life he had always wanted. But something in his voice when he spoke about Vivienne suggested that respectability was not providing the satisfaction he had expected. "I saw your interview in that magazine," he said during one such call. "You looked different." "I am different. You've done well for yourself, better than I expected, better than you told me I could do." The silence that followed was heavy with words neither of us said. Whatever Terrence was feeling, regret, envy, the uncomfortable recognition of his own errors, he kept it to himself, and I had stopped caring enough to ask. The invitation from Copenhagen arrived on a Tuesday in March, slipped among the usual business correspondence with no fanfare to suggest its significance. A request from the royal household of Denmark, inquiring whether Vivienne would be interested in creating pieces for official functions. I read it 3 times before I believed it was real. The Danish royal family had long been known for their support of contemporary design, often wearing pieces from innovative artists rather than traditional court jewelers. Queen Margrethe III, who had ascended to the throne 5 years earlier, was particularly celebrated for her bold fashion choices and her willingness to spotlight emerging talents. And now her people were reaching out to me. "This is insane," Zara said when I showed her the letter. "Mom, the Queen of Denmark wants you to make jewelry for her. They want to discuss the possibility. Nothing is confirmed. The Danish royal family doesn't reach out to discuss possibilities unless they're serious." She grabbed my hands, her excitement infectious. "This is it, Mom. This is the moment everything changes. I looked at my daughter, at the studio we had built together, at the pieces waiting to find their owners. 14 years ago, Terrence had laughed at a necklace I made in our basement. Now royalty was asking me to adorn them. Call them back, I said. Tell them I'm interested. Interested was an understatement. I was terrified, exhilarated, and absolutely determined to rise to this occasion. The meeting was set for June in Copenhagen. I would present my portfolio and designs to the Queen's personal secretary and the head of the royal household, with the possibility of a brief audience with Her Majesty herself if the initial discussions went well. I spent the months leading up to the trip preparing obsessively. I developed a collection specifically for the presentation, pieces that combined the African heritage at Vivienne's core with elements inspired by Danish design traditions. Clean lines, functional elegance, the minimalism that Scandinavian aesthetics were known for. The result was something new, a fusion that felt both true to my roots and respectful of the culture I would be entering. This is different from what you usually do, Zara observed, examining the prototype pieces. More restrained. I'm adapting to a new audience. The Queen isn't going to wear statement pieces that dominate her image. She needs jewelry that complements without overwhelming. But you're keeping the symbols? The symbols are who we are. I'm just translating them. I held up a pendant I had designed, a subtle interpretation of the Nyame Ye Ohene symbol, God is King, rendered in white gold with tiny diamonds. See? Still meaningful? Just whispered instead of shouted? Zara nodded slowly, understanding dawning. You're not changing yourself. You're learning a new language. Exactly. Copenhagen in June was a revelation. Long days of soft northern light, elegant architecture that seemed both ancient and modern, a people whose reserve masked genuine warmth. I stayed at a hotel near the harbor, spending my free time walking the streets and absorbing the aesthetic sensibility that had shaped Danish design. The meeting was held at Amalienborg Palace, the royal residence, in a conference room that managed to be both grand and welcoming. The Queen's secretary, a gracious woman named Ingrid, reviewed my portfolio with the careful attention of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. Your work has a narrative quality that we appreciate, she said, pausing on a photograph of the wisdom cuff that Destiny Morgan had worn. Each piece tells a story. Her Majesty is particularly drawn to jewelry that carries meaning beyond mere decoration. That's the foundation of everything I create. My grandmother taught me that the gold remembers, that every piece carries the intentions and history of its maker. Ingrid smiled. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. The conversation continued for over an hour, covering technical questions about materials and techniques, logistical matters about timelines and security, and broader discussions about what kind of pieces might suit royal functions. By the end, I felt cautiously optimistic, but knew that the final decision was not Ingrid's to make. Her Majesty would like to meet you, Ingrid said as we concluded. She has reviewed your portfolio and is quite taken with your work. Would you be available tomorrow afternoon? I would be available anytime, anywhere, for as long as they needed. Queen Margrethe III was shorter than I expected, with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and humor. She received me in a private sitting room, the kind of space that was obviously used for actual living rather than state functions, and put me at ease immediately. Mrs. Cole, I've been looking forward to meeting you. Her English was perfect, with a slight Danish accent that lent it music. Your pieces are quite remarkable. Thank you, Your Majesty. It's an honor to be here. Please, sit. She gestured to a chair across from her own. Tell me about your grandmother, the one who taught you. So I told her about Opal, about the migration from Ghana, about the traditions that had survived across oceans and generations. The Queen listened with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed she had done her research about African metalworking traditions and their contemporary applications. There is something beautiful about preserving knowledge this way, she said when I finished, passing it from hand to hand, mother to daughter, across time. It's what we try to do in royal families, of course, though our traditions are rather different. All traditions have value, Your Majesty. They connect us to who we came from. Precisely. She smiled. I would like you to create pieces for me, Mrs. Cole, not just for official functions, but personal pieces as well. Something I can wear and know carries meaning. I felt tears threaten and blink them back. I would be honored. Good. Ingrid will work out the details with you. She stood, signaling the audience was concluding, but paused before I could rise. I understand your path to this moment was not easy, that there were those who did not believe in your work. I thought of Terence, of the laughing dismissal, of years of being told my art was worthless. There were challenges, yes. There always are, for women who create, for those who preserve what others wish to forget. The Queen met my eyes with an intensity that felt like blessing. You have built something remarkable, Mrs. Cole. Something that will outlast those who doubted you. Remember that. I did. I would always remember. The commission that followed was the most significant of my career. Over 6 months, I created a collection specifically for the Queen. A collar necklace that could be worn in multiple configurations, matching earrings that ranged from subtle to statement, cuffs for both formal and informal occasions, and a brooch that incorporated elements of both Ghanaian and Danish symbolism. Each piece was photographed, documented, and delivered with the ceremony that royal commissions required. I traveled to Copenhagen 3 more times during the process, meeting with palace staff, adjusting designs based on feedback, ensuring that every element was perfect. When the final pieces were completed and delivered, I stood in my New York studio and felt a sense of completion I had never experienced before. Whatever happened next, I had reached a pinnacle that could not be taken away. The Queen wore the collection for the first time at a state dinner 3 months later, the event that would generate the photograph now displayed on my phone. That image, royalty adorned in my art, was the answer to every dismissal I had ever received. Craft fair stuff, Terence had called it. Now it gleamed on a queen. The photograph of Queen Margrethe wearing my pieces circulated through fashion and news media for weeks, accompanied by profiles and interviews that traced my journey from Detroit basement to Royal Palace. I told my story dozens of times, to outlets ranging from local news to international fashion magazines, always returning to the themes that defined my work: heritage, memory, the gold that remembers. I did not mention Terence by name in most interviews. His dismissal was part of my story, but I was not interested in revenge narratives or public humiliation. What mattered was not his failure to see my value, but my refusal to accept his assessment as truth. Still, word reached him. Friends of friends, social media connections, the inevitable circulation of success stories through communities that had known us both. I heard through Marcus that Terence had seen the coverage, that he had reacted with a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been regret. He reached out directly after the Vogue profile appeared, a text message that took me by surprise. Saw the magazine. Congratulations. You've proven everyone wrong. I stared at the message for a long time, considering responses. In the end, I kept it simple. Thank you. Nothing more was necessary. We were not enemies, but we were also not friends, and I had no interest in performing reconciliation for his comfort. He had made his choices. So had I. The Royal Commission opened doors that had previously been closed. Luxury department stores that had ignored our inquiries now sought partnerships. Private collectors with 7-figure budgets requested custom pieces. Museums approached us about acquisitions for their permanent collections. Vivienne expanded to meet the demand. We opened a second studio in London, positioning ourselves closer to European markets. We launched the accessible line Zara had proposed, using sterling silver and semi-precious stones to create pieces that carried our heritage at price points that middle-class customers could afford. We developed an apprenticeship program that trained young jewelry makers from underrepresented communities, passing on techniques that might otherwise have been lost. My mother lived long enough to see all of it. She had struggled with declining health for years, but held on with characteristic determination, insisting on attending every major milestone. She was there when we opened the London studio, frail but radiant, telling anyone who would listen that her daughter had always been meant for greatness. "Your grandmother is so proud," she told me, her words slurring slightly from the medication but her meaning clear. "She's watching, you know, from wherever she is. She's watching and she's dancing." "I know, Mama. You took what she gave you and made it bigger than any of us could have imagined." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "That's what we're supposed to do. Make it bigger. Make it last." She passed away 3 months later, peacefully, surrounded by family. I delivered her eulogy in the same church where I had first sold a pair of earrings, the church where my journey had truly begun. "My mother taught me that creation is a form of love," I said, "that making something beautiful is an act of faith. She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. She saw my potential when others saw only hobby." I looked out at the congregation, seeing friends and family and clients who had become friends. Everything I've built is because she raised me to believe I could. Everything Vivienne has become is her legacy as much as mine. Zara took on more responsibility as I stepped back from daily operations. She had become a formidable businesswoman, negotiating contracts with the same skills she brought to designing pieces. At 25, she was effectively running the company while I focused on creative direction and the public-facing work that my position required. "You should write a book," she suggested one evening as we reviewed quarterly projections in the New York studio. "Your story is incredible. People would want to read it." "A book about jewelry?" "A book about you, about building something when everyone told you it was impossible, about proving that tradition and modernity can coexist." She grinned. "About showing your ex-husband how wrong he was. I'm not interested in making Terrence the villain of my story. He doesn't have to be the villain. He can be an obstacle, a chapter you moved past." She shrugged. "The point isn't him anyway. The point is you." I considered her suggestion. The story had power, I knew. I had seen it in the eyes of women who heard my journey, who recognized their own struggles in mine, who took courage from my success. Maybe putting it in writing would reach people I could never meet in person. "I'll think about it," I said. "That's what you always say before you say yes." She was right. The book was published 2 years later, a memoir that traced my path from grandmother's teachings to royal commission. It became a bestseller, translated into a dozen languages, adapted into a documentary that premiered at film festivals. The documentary brought attention to aspects of my story I had kept private. The decades of dismissal, the laughter that had nearly broken me, the divorce that had freed me. It also introduced audiences to my grandmother's teachings, to the Adinkra symbols that defined my work, to the philosophy of gold that remembers. "This is what I wanted people to understand," I explained in one interview. "My jewelry isn't just decoration, it's connection. When you wear one of my pieces, you're wearing generations of knowledge, centuries of tradition, the love of women who came before you. That's what my husband couldn't see. That's what I spent my life proving." The final vindication came not through any single moment, but through the accumulation of recognition that defined my later career. The Lifetime Achievement Award from the Council of Fashion Designers of America, the retrospective at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the invitation to create a piece for the Smithsonian's collection of African American art. Each honor was meaningful, but what mattered most was the knowledge that my grandmother's traditions would survive. Zara was training the next generation, teaching them as I had taught her, as Opal had taught me. The gold would remember not just our history, but our future, carrying forward what we had created long after I was gone. Terrence reached out one last time when the Smithsonian acquisition was announced. His message was longer this time, more reflective. "I've thought a lot about what I said all those years ago, about your jewelry being craft fair stuff. I was wrong. I was threatened by your talent, by your passion, by the way you lit up when you worked. I tried to diminish you because I was afraid you would outgrow me." I read the message several times, feeling the weight of an apology 14 years late. "You were right to be afraid," I typed back. "I did outgrow you, but I might not have if you'd supported me from the beginning. You'll never know what we might have built together." His response came an hour later. "I know, and I'm sorry." I did not reply. Some conversations have natural endings, and ours had reached theirs. The years that followed were a time of consolidation and legacy building. Vivienne expanded to a third location in Paris, completing a triangular presence that positioned us perfectly for the European luxury market. We launched a foundation that provided scholarships to young jewelry makers from African diaspora communities, ensuring that our traditions would continue to evolve and thrive. I stepped back from public appearances, preferring the quiet of my studio to the demands of celebrity. Zara became the face of the company, her youth and vision appealing to new generations of customers, while I focused on the creative work that had always been my true passion. My grandchildren, Zara had married and started a family, became frequent visitors to the studio. They watched me work with the same fascination I had felt watching my grandmother, absorbing through observation the skills that would someday be theirs to develop. "Grandma, why does the gold remember?" my granddaughter asked one afternoon, her small hands touching a pendant I was crafting. "Because we put our love into it, baby. Our thoughts, our feelings, our intentions. The gold holds on to all of that, and when someone wears it, they can feel what we put in. Is that why your jewelry is special? That's why all handmade jewelry is special, but ours carries something extra. It carries where we came from, Africa, our ancestors, generations of people who worked with gold before us." She nodded solemnly, absorbing information she couldn't fully understand but would someday appreciate. "Can I learn? When your hands are ready, I'll teach you everything I know." The final royal commission came unexpectedly, 10 years after the first. Queen Margrethe was stepping back from public duties, transitioning to a more private role as her health required. She wanted one final set of pieces from Vivienne, personal jewelry she would wear in her retirement, pieces that would accompany her through the quiet years ahead. I traveled to Copenhagen myself, despite my preference for staying close to home. Some clients deserved personal attention, and the Queen had been instrumental in legitimizing my work on the international stage. "You've changed the world of jewelry," she told me during our meeting. Her voice softer now, her movements slower, but her eyes still sharp. "You've shown that tradition and innovation can walk together, that heritage is not a cage, but a foundation. You gave me the platform to do that, Your Majesty. I gave you an opportunity. You made something of it." She smiled. "That is always the way. We open doors. Others choose whether to walk through." The pieces I created for her retirement were my finest work. A set of meditation rings, one for each finger, each bearing a different symbol representing aspects of a life well lived. Wisdom, strength, love, faith, legacy. She wore them in her final years, private jewelry for private moments, carrying the meanings I had poured into them. When she passed away, years later, I received a personal note from her daughter, the new queen. "She wore your rings until the end. She said they reminded her of all she had accomplished and all she hoped for the future. Thank you for giving her that comfort." I framed the note and hung it in my studio, beside the photograph of my grandmother that had watched over my work for decades. At 65, I began planning my own transition. Vivienne was in capable hands with Zara, who had proven herself a brilliant leader as well as a talented designer. The foundation was thriving, having supported hundreds of young artists in its years of operation. My work was represented in museums and private collections around the world, permanent testaments to the traditions I had carried forward. What remained was to ensure that knowledge passed to the next generation as completely as possible. I began documenting everything: techniques, symbols, sources, stories. I recorded videos of myself working, narrating my process, so that future learners could study not just the physical movements, but the thinking behind them. "This is for you," I told my grandchildren during one recording session, "and for everyone who comes after you. What your great-great-grandmother taught me, what I've taught your mother, what will someday be yours. The gold remembers, and these recordings will help it remember even more. Marcus, who had become a documentary filmmaker, helped me produce the educational series that emerged from these recordings. Vivienne, The Art of Heritage Jewelry, was released on streaming platforms, reaching audiences I could never have imagined reaching through traditional means. Young jewelry makers around the world watched and learned. I received letters and emails from students in Nigeria and Ghana, in Brazil and Jamaica, in Detroit and New York, telling me how my techniques had inspired their own work. The gold was remembering through their hands now, spreading across the world like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. My final piece was made for myself, not for any client. A ring bearing the Sankofa bird, the same symbol I had used in that first necklace that Terrence had dismissed as craft fair stuff. But this version was different, more refined, more confident, carrying everything I had learned in 40 years of working with gold. I wore it when I traveled back to Detroit for my grandmother's birthday commemoration, an annual gathering of family members who came together to remember and celebrate the woman who had started everything. I stood at her graveside, the ring catching the spring sunlight, feeling the connection across generations that had always been the heart of my work. "I did it, Grandma," I whispered. "Everything you hoped for me and more. Queens wear my jewelry now, museums display my work, and I'm teaching my grandchildren just like you taught me." A breeze rustled through the cemetery trees, carrying the scent of magnolia blossoms, feeling almost like a response. "The gold remembers," I said softly. "And so do I." The morning that photograph appeared, Queen Margrethe III at the state dinner, my jewelry gleaming against her gown, I sat in my New York studio and cried. Not tears of triumph, though I felt triumphant. Not tears of vindication, though I felt vindicated. Tears of something deeper, something that encompassed the entire journey from basement workshop to royal palace. I had received word of the Queen's intention to wear the pieces, of course. Royal protocol required advance notice for such things, and I had spent the preceding days in a state of anxious anticipation. But seeing the actual photographs, the evidence that my work had adorned royalty, was different from knowing it would happen. The image spread across social media within hours, accompanied by analysis of the jewelry's symbolism and praise for the Queen's bold choice. Vivienne trended globally. Our website crashed for the third time in our history, and I spent the day fielding calls from journalists and well-wishers who wanted to share in the celebration. But the moment that mattered most came that evening, when the chaos had subsided, and I sat alone in my studio, looking at the photograph on my phone. I called Zara. "Did you see it?" she asked, her voice bright with excitement. "I've seen it 1,000 times. I can't stop looking at it." "How do you feel?" I considered the question carefully. "I feel like I proved something. Not to anyone else, not to Terrence, not to the doubters, not to anyone who dismissed my work. I feel like I proved it to myself, that I was right all along." "You were always right, Mom." "I know. But it's different to know it and to see it, to have evidence you can hold in your hand." I looked at the ring on my own finger, the Sankofa bird catching the studio light. "Your great-great-grandmother would have loved this moment." "She's here, Mom. She's always here." I nodded, though Zara couldn't see me. The studio was filled with presents, with the accumulated energy of years of work, with the love and intention I had poured into every piece that had left these benches. "I want to do something special," I said, "to mark this occasion, something that honors where we came from." "What did you have in mind?" "I want to recreate the first necklace, the Sankofa piece I made in my basement, the one your father laughed at." I had not spoken of that necklace in years, but it had never left my memory. "I want to make it again, with everything I've learned since then, and I want to donate it to a museum, so people can see where this journey began." The recreation took 3 months, longer than any piece I had made in years. I worked slowly, deliberately, pouring into the gold everything I had learned in 4 decades of practice. The Sankofa birds emerged from my hands more refined than the originals, more sophisticated in technique, but carrying the same meaning that had inspired me all those years ago. When I finished, I held the necklace up to the light and saw not just the piece itself, but the ghost of its predecessor, the one that had launched everything. They were connected across time, the first and the last, the dismissed and the celebrated. "It's beautiful," Zara said when she saw it. "More beautiful than any photograph could capture. This is where it started, this exact design, this exact symbol." Terrence laughed at it and called it craft fair stuff. And now a version of it is going to hang in a museum. Several museums wanted it, actually. I chose the Smithsonian. It felt right to have it in Washington, in the National Collection, representing American art. The donation ceremony was held the following spring, a formal event that brought together art world figures, fashion industry leaders, and family members who had witnessed my journey from the beginning. I gave a speech that traced the arc from grandmother's kitchen to royal palace, from dismissed housewife to celebrated artist. 40 years ago, I said, I made a necklace in my basement. I showed it to my husband, hoping for encouragement. He laughed at it. He called it craft fair stuff, worthless, embarrassing. The audience was silent, listening with the attention that comes from recognition. Many of them had faced similar dismissals in their own lives. That night, I promised myself I would prove him wrong. Not for revenge. I was never interested in revenge. For truth. For the certainty that what I made had value, regardless of whether he could see it. I gestured to the display case where the new Sankofa necklace would soon be placed. This piece represents both the beginning and the fulfillment of that promise. It carries the same symbol, the same meaning, the same intention as the one I made 4 decades ago. But it also carries everything I've learned since then. Technique and experience, growth and wisdom, the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime spent working with gold. I paused, feeling the weight of the moment. My grandmother taught me that the gold remembers. She meant that every piece we create carries the intentions and history of its maker. But I've learned that it remembers more than that. It remembers everyone who touches it, the makers and the wearers, the admirers and the critics. It remembers the laughter and the tears, the doubt and the determination. I looked out at the audience, at faces that held understanding and appreciation. This necklace remembers a young woman crying alone in her basement. It remembers a grandmother's patient teaching. It remembers years of secret work and silent growth. It remembers divorce and rebuilding. It remembers a queen who chose to wear my art. It remembers everything that brought me here. I stepped back from the podium, signaling that my formal remarks were complete. And now it will remember all of you who came to witness its final home. The necklace was installed in a gallery dedicated to African American art, positioned where natural light would catch its gold and make it gleam. I visited it often in the months that followed, sometimes alone, sometimes with Zara or the grandchildren, always feeling the connection to the woman I had been and the legacy I was leaving. Terrence never saw the piece in person, though I heard through Marcus that he had seen coverage of the donation ceremony. What he thought about it, whether he felt regret or understanding or simply indifference, I did not know and did not particularly care. He had been part of my story, but he was not its author. That role belonged to me alone. 5 years after the Smithsonian donation, I retired fully from active work. Zara was more than capable of leading Vivienne into its next chapter, and I had taught her everything I knew. The gold would continue to remember through her hands, and through the hands of the grandchildren who were beginning to learn the craft themselves. On my last day in the studio, I sat at my workbench and looked around at the space that had been my sanctuary for decades. The tools hung in their places, the metals weighted in their containers, the symbols I had worked with all my life adorned the walls. It was exactly as it should be, ready for the next generation to take their seats. I thought about my grandmother Opal, teaching me in her kitchen in Detroit. I thought about my mother, supporting my dreams even when others doubted. I thought about Terrence's laughter, and the determination it had sparked in me. I thought about queens and museums, about daughters and grandchildren, about the unbroken chain of knowledge that stretched from West Africa to this studio in New York. The gold remembers, I said to the empty room. And now, so does the world. I turned off the lights and walked out, leaving the studio to the ones who would come after. The years of retirement were not empty, but filled with a different kind of richness. I traveled to Ghana again, visiting the artisans who had become partners over decades, watching the training programs we had established produce new generations of skilled metalworkers. I spent time with my grandchildren, now old enough to appreciate the stories I could tell, eager for the lessons I could share. Marcus made a second documentary about me, a retrospective that traced my entire career and explored the impact Vivienne had made on the jewelry world. He interviewed critics, collectors, museum curators, and fellow designers, weaving together a portrait of an artist who had helped redefine what jewelry could be. "You made African heritage fashionable in the luxury market," one curator said in the film. "Before Vivienne, there was a perception that African-inspired jewelry was folk art, not fine art. You shattered that distinction. You proved that heritage could be elevated, that tradition could be innovation." I watched the documentary at its premiere, surrounded by family and friends, and felt a peace I had not known was possible. The work was done. The legacy was secure. The gold would remember, carried forward by hands I had trained and minds I had inspired. My grandmother had been dead for 40 years when I finally understood what she meant about the gold remembering. I was sitting in her old neighborhood in Detroit, visiting the cemetery where she was buried, feeling the presence of all the women who had come before me. The gold did not just remember what we put into it. It remembered what we hoped for, what we feared, what we loved. It carried our dreams across generations, connecting the living to the dead, the present to the past. When I made a piece of jewelry, I was not just shaping metal. I was adding my voice to a conversation that had been going on for centuries. Terrence had heard craft fair stuff because that was all he could hear. The gold had been speaking of ancestors and traditions, of migration and survival, of beauty created in the face of dismissal. He had been deaf to those voices. His loss, not mine. I placed flowers on my grandmother's grave and sat in the grass beside her stone, the Detroit sun warm on my face. "I did everything you asked of me, Grandma. I learned the techniques. I passed them on. I made the gold remember things worth remembering." A bird landed on a nearby branch, watching me with bright eyes. Not a Sankofa bird, just a common sparrow, but I chose to see meaning in its presence anyway. A queen wore my jewelry. Can you imagine? The things you made in your kitchen, the things you taught me in secret, they led to royalty, to museums, to everything. The bird chirped once and flew away. I smiled and stood, brushing grass from my clothes. "Thank you, Grandma, for everything." The final piece I ever created, truly the last, a conscious decision to end where I had begun, was a small pendant bearing my grandmother's name in Akan script. I made it for myself, to wear against my heart, to carry with me whatever time I had left. It was not a significant piece by the standards of my career. No precious stones, no complex engineering, no museum-worthy innovation. Just gold wire shaped into letters, carrying a name that had shaped my life. But it was perfect. It was exactly what I wanted. And when I wore it, I felt my grandmother's presence as surely as I had felt it in her kitchen 50 years before. "Opal," I whispered, touching the pendant. "This is for you." The gold remembered. And so, finally, did the world. Zara called me on my 80th birthday with news that felt like a gift from the universe. "Mom, I just got word. The Victoria and Albert Museum wants to do a retrospective, a major exhibition covering your entire career, from the first Sankofa necklace to the royal commissions. They want to call it The Gold Remembers." I laughed, the irony of the title not lost on me. "That's your great-great-grandmother's phrase." "I know," I told them. They loved it even more. When would this happen? "They're proposing next year. They want you to be there for the opening, obviously. Can you travel? I considered my health, my energy, my desire to witness one more celebration of the work that had defined my life. For this, I'll find a way. The exhibition opened 14 months later in the Grand Galleries of the V&A, London's premier museum of art and design. I attended with Zara and her children, with Marcus and his family, with friends and colleagues who had been part of my journey for decades. Walking through the galleries, seeing my work displayed alongside the treasures of human creativity, I felt the completion I had been seeking. The gold that had begun as craft fair stuff now hung in museum cases, illuminated by carefully calibrated lights, explained by scholarly text, admired by visitors from around the world. Near the exit, I paused before the final display, the photograph of Queen Margrethe wearing my pieces, blown up to nearly life-size, accompanied by a placard that told the story of how a dismissed housewife from Detroit had come to adorn royalty. "You did it, Mom," Zara said, her arm through mine. "You really did it." "We did it," I corrected. "You and me and everyone who believed when others laughed." I touched the pendant at my throat, the one bearing my grandmother's name, and felt the warmth of the gold against my skin. "The gold remembers," I said softly. "And now, so will everyone who walks through these galleries." We stepped out into the London afternoon, into a world that finally understood what I had always known. My craft fair stuff was priceless, and no one would ever laugh at it again.